Throughout the 19th century and up to the early 1900s, London was very much a horse-drawn society. The streets of the city centre resounded to the thundering of hooves and carriage wheels. The horse was essential not only for London transport, but for emergency services. Horse-drawn fire engines equipped with special quick-fitting harnesses could be on the road and galloping to the rescue within a few minutes. They could achieve an impressive turn of speed. But most horse-drawn traffic was slow. The juggernaut hauling a heavy load was a long, long vehicle. Though we now have a romantic view of the age of the horse, it produced in its own way as much pollution and congestion as any petrol engine. The mess a horse could make is recalled vividly by Lady Charlotte Bonham Carter.
Oh, my word. The side streets were not so bad, but of course it was all the horse-drawn, slow vehicles. The way they cluttered up the roads, it was simply astounding. It was so very different from now. And sometimes with a sudden shower, the streets got terribly muddy, but there were always these delightful old crossing sweepers. They were elderly males, very often with beards. Generally they had a beard. The moment of being clean-shaved wasn't yet then. And if they saw one across the street, if one waved to them, they'd come over and sweep in front of one as one walked across. And on one occasion, I was having lunch at St. James's Palace with a young Guards officer, Alan Adair. He was in the Grenadiers. And he was a delightful friend. Just as I was approaching him, the most appalling storm came. Absolutely frightful. And the road between St. James's Street and St. James's Palace became a sort of a duck pond. There was no crossing sweeper there, and I had on my very best pair of white suede shoes. Well, I had to be there on time. There was nothing for it. I had just to plunge in and cross over. I have arrived with my shoes in the most appalling state. However, they were very kind to me the other day, and I took them off and they managed to dry them. They never were the same again.
For those who could afford the fare, the horse provided a variety of ways of getting about town. The well-to-do might get their servants to call up a hansom cab.
In order to get from one place to another in the evenings, one had to take either a four-wheeler, which was a cab, or a hansom cab. And one's parlourmaid whistled for it. And down the streets I remember hearing these single whistles for the four-wheeler. Whistles were twice for hansom cabs, you heard them. Between 6 and 8, one heard particularly these whistles going on up and down the streets. And then the hansom cab was a delightful vehicle.
The horse bus, which, like the hansom cab, was an innovation of the 1830s in London, provided the middle classes with regular services from suburb to city centre. Later in the century, the horse tram arrived, offering cheaper and more convenient transport for the less well-off Londoner. Both buses and trams were privately run, and though they generally catered for different classes, there was a good deal of rivalry between them, as Ted Harrison remembers.
Well, I just remember the horse buses, but I can remember the trams quite well. And the old bloke standing in front of the driver, he'd have a sou'wester on in the winter time and a tarpaulin up the front and his whip, and any vans got in the way, he used to stamp on the bell there and F and blind at the horse driver, you know, to get him out of the way, and he used to shout back. Because he was high up, he was on a dicky, you see, with his pair of horses, and he could look down and he used to gob on the tram driver like that.
The age of horse-drawn London seems quaint and comical now, but it had serious problems of traffic congestion, which led to even more serious social consequences. The building of new roads and railways led to demolition on an enormous scale in the centre of London, and thousands of poor people were made homeless with no right to compensation or rehousing. And though new transport services were introduced to carry commuters to Victorian suburbs, the poor couldn't afford them. They remained trapped in the overcrowded centre until late in the 19th century, when new and cheaper forms of transport allowed them an escape route. For the well-to-do, however, the habit of commuting from suburb to city centre was already established in the early 19th century. In 1823, William Cobbett, the social reformer, noted,
"Great parcels of stock jobbers stay at Brighton with the women and children. They skip backwards and forwards on the coaches and actually carry on stock jobbing in Change Alley, though they reside at Brighton."
There were other forms of commuting at this time. Steam packets on the Thames carried workers into London from places like Greenwich. The river had once been London's central highway, but the services it could offer were limited and unreliable. Steam packets were more vulnerable to bad weather than other forms of transport and suffered a series of dramatic accidents. For these reasons, they had only restricted success as commuter carriers. The first real innovation in public transport was the horse bus. It was a Parisienne idea introduced to London by George Schillebeer in 1829. Schillebeer ran the first route from Paddington, just developed at the time as a fashionable area, to the Bank. The idea of providing regular services in London, sometimes in competition with a short-stop stagecoach, soon caught on, and the horse bus provided the better off with a popular way of getting to and from work. Shortly after the appearance of the horse bus, the first passenger railway arrived in London. It ran on a short route of just over 4 miles from Greenwich to London Bridge and was clearly intended to cream off commuter traffic from existing services. John Freeborn of the London Transport Museum has made a special study of the motives behind the first railway company to build in London.
Greenwich was a commuter railway, or was seen as a commuter railway, and the other ways that people would have come from Greenwich up to London Bridge to get to the city would be by the steamer on the Thames or by the short stagecoach. But of course, the people who were trying to raise money for this new railway company had to look at the economics of it. Now, they're quite simple. If you go by river, it would take you between an hour, hour and a half, depending which way the tide is running, and it cost you 9p. If you went on the short stagecoach, it would take you about an hour, and it cost you a shilling. But the railway was going to do the same journey in 12 minutes, and it would cost you a shilling, or if you were willing to travel in an open wagon, it would only cost you 6p. 6p, of course, is 2.5p in modern coinage, though at that time it was worth a lot more money.
Though the London to Greenwich Railway was designed as a commuter line, most other railways which arrived in London in the same period were not. These included the London and Birmingham's line into Euston in 1837, the Great Western, which began services from Paddington in 1838, and the line from the south into Nine Elms, extended to Waterloo in 1848. Railway companies at this time were not generally interested in commuters. They catered for the wealthy, long-distance traveller. The first stop out of Paddington for the first 30 years of Great Western operation was Ealing. And on the London and Birmingham, the nearest station to Euston was Harrow. There was nevertheless already heavy commuter traffic into the city. From suburbs to the north and west, places like Paddington, Camden Town and Hackney, and in the south from places like Deptford, Camberwell and Clapham. Charles Pearson, the City of London solicitor, put the number of daily commuters at 250,000 in 1854. He thought 15,000 arrived by the steamer, another 27,000 arrived by train, and about 44,000 got to town on the horse bus services. All the rest, about 200,000 of them, walked to work, covering up to 3 or 4 miles each day in their trip from the suburbs. The available forms of commuter transport, including the horse bus, were still too expensive for the majority of city workers.
Well, the horse bus was very expensive, and therefore not everyone could use it. One of the problems was it didn't run very early in the morning, so obviously it wouldn't be suitable for most workers who needed to get into town. However, buses did run from places like Camberwell to Oxford Circus, Brixton, Camden Town, into the centre. This meant that they were used by some commuters and became very fashionable in the centre of town.
But while commuting was beyond the pockets of the poor, it did have a tremendous effect on their lives in other ways. The railways in particular changed the face of London. In the first railway boom in the 1840s, lines were brought in as far as the New Road, London's 18th century bypass, and now the Euston-Marylebone Road. They were kept out of the West End by landed interest and Parliament. And to the south they weren't able to cross the river. However, the cuttings and arches which carried them to the edge of town scarred the landscape and carved up whole districts. In his novel Dombey and Son, Charles Dickens gives a vivid description of the contrast between the destructiveness of the railways and the comfort of the wealthy traveller, Mr. Dombey, as he arrives in London.
Everything around is blackened. There are dark pools of water, muddy lanes, and miserable habitants far below. There are jagged walls and filthy houses close at hand, and through the battered roofs and broken windows, wretched rooms are seen. As Mr. Dombey looks out of his carriage window, it is never in his thoughts that the monster who brought him there has let the light of day in on these things.
The railways created great areas of blight and destroyed housing, ploughing through poor districts where the land was cheapest. And in the second great boom in railway building in the 1860s, when many more lines were cut through already built-up areas, the destruction was even more widespread. And from 1863, the building of the first steam underground railway, the Metropolitan and District lines, to provide a link between the main stations, led to even more demolitions and eviction of poor people. But it wasn't just the building of railways themselves which destroyed whole areas. Although the train quickly killed off the stagecoach, its slow arrival over long distances, in London it created increased demand for horse-drawn traffic. All passengers and goods arriving at the mainline stations had to get to their destinations in horse cabs or buses or carts. Railway companies themselves kept hundreds of horses for their road haulage business. And as London's population grew and commuting increased, the amount of horse-drawn traffic on the road went up and up. Terrible traffic jams clogged the narrow streets of the capital, and it gradually became clear that the old road system simply couldn't cope. The Victorian solution to the problem was to cut new roads, demolishing whole areas along the way. New Oxford Street and Victoria Street are just two of the roads built in this way. In easing traffic congestion, the Victorians thought they could solve a social problem as well, by demolishing the rookeries, as the worst slums were called, to make way for roads. This was standard practice in the 19th century. Demolitions and evictions were involved in building Farringdon Road in the first half of the century. More were caused in 1869, when Holborn Viaduct was built to ease the flow of horse-drawn traffic across the Fleet Valley. It was estimated that up to 2,000 people were made homeless by the demolitions for Holborn Viaduct alone. And there was no effective provision to ensure that the evicted were rehoused. In the 1870s, the building of homes for the working classes was left to private charities. There were many working-class tenements built in the centre of London to house the displaced working people, but the poorest couldn't afford them, and there were never enough for the artisans working in town who could. Better off Londoners, right down to clerks who could afford the rent of a suburban house and whose hours of work allowed them to walk to the centre, could escape the housing crisis by commuting. But poorer Londoners, who often had to be at work early and whose wage would not pay the fares to commute to suburbia, were trapped in the centre of town. By the mid-1860s, inner city deprivation was reaching crisis point. Continued demolitions finally forced the government of the day to take some positive action to help poorer Londoners to move out. The building of a new terminus for the North London Railway at Broad Street was to have involved the eviction of a large number of people. As compensation, the company had to agree to provide cheap workmen's fares in the early morning, so that the poorer sections of the population would have a better chance of moving out. The railway companies resisted, but by the 1880s, cheap workmen's fares were provided on nearly all lines, and they were particularly cheap on the Great Eastern services. At the same time, another new development emerged, which was to make public transport more accessible to the poor, the horse tram. It was brought to London by an American who was confusingly called George F. Train. He ran his first experimental service in 1861, but without much success. Train made the mistake of trying the tram out in the West End. The upper crust didn't like it, as their carriage wheels caught in the tram lines, and the new vehicle hogged the fixed route along the road. It was thrown out. But the horse tram proved it could be a success in the north of England. And though it was never allowed into London's West End, an extensive network was developed from 1870 onwards. By 1874, there were horse trams running into town from Archway, Finsbury Park, Stamford Hill, Hackney, Stratford and Poplar. And from the south, tram lines were laid from New Cross, Camberwell Green, Brixton and Stockwell. The tram was in effect a street railway. The Americans called it that, and as such had to provide cheap workmen's services. This made it a much cheaper form of transport than the bus.
The horse tram was one of the most significant things that happened in the 19th century. One of the great things about it is that because it runs on rails rather than the buses running on the cobblestones, it's actually easier to move it along. So with the same driver, 2 horses, a conductor, you could carry twice as many people as you could with the horse bus. That means, of course, you can offer lower fares, and since they were railways, they were already obliged to offer cheap workmen's fares early in the morning. So you now have 2 important things coming together: early morning transport and cheap transport. So for the first time, people could afford to move away from the centre of London and live in the sunny suburbs of Camberwell and Peckham and whatever, and still manage to commute to work very cheaply.
The horse tram became the characteristic working-class means of travel, and remained so until the early years of the 20th century.
The horse buses, the people who used to travel on them was shopkeepers, publicans, and managers, foremen, and people like that. The tough-nosed people. But us poor sods never used to ride on a bus or a tram. We used to ride on a tram, yes, but not on the horse bus.
The most significant effect of the horse tram was to allow poorer people, though not the poorest, to live further out of the centre of London. As a consequence, its introduction was often resisted by the middle class in suburbs like Brixton or Hampstead.
Of course, it became, therefore, very much associated with working class people, and a lot of the suburbs didn't really want the tram to come in there. Hampstead, for example, protested very vigorously when the horse tram was proposed to come up into Hampstead, and they managed to get it stopped. But the trams spread enormously, so 5 years after the first horse trams in London in 1870, you've got something like 49 million passenger journeys a year. That's some measure of the impact.
By the end of the century, the horse trams were carrying more passengers than any other form of transport in London, and along with cheap workmen's trains were leading to the colonisation by the working classes of established suburbs. And a modest kind of working-class suburb began to be built in the northeast and southeast of London, in places like Walthamstow and Plumstead. Cheap workmen's travel, whether provided by railways or trams, was not always popular. Towards the end of the century, the manager of the Great Eastern Railway, which provided more workmen's services than any other company, complained,
"Wherever you locate the working man in large numbers, you utterly destroy that neighbourhood for ordinary passenger traffic. Take, for instance, the neighbourhood of Stamford Hill, Tottenham and Edmonton. That used to be a very nice neighbourhood. But very soon after this obligation was put on the Great Eastern of issuing workmen's tickets, the district is given up entirely, I might say now, to the working man."
And in 1884, the chairman of London Tramways boasted,
"We have relieved London of an immense number of poor people by carrying them out to the suburbs. Building has been going on very largely on our line of roads in South London."
So the train and cheap workmen's fares led to a spate of new suburb building in the late 19th century, just as more expensive forms of commuter transport had encouraged the development of earlier suburbs. The only area which was untouched by the developments in commuter transport was the West End. Its rich and powerful occupants had ensured that it remained aloof from the tram and the train. One consequence of this was that there were no railway or tram routes crossing the heart of London. That situation was to change with the development of a radically new form of transport, the deep-level underground. London's underground was already 20 years old by the 1880s, but the trains were steam-driven, and because of smoke, they ran in open cuttings for much of the route. The district line remained steam-driven until 1905. As a young man, George Spiller worked as a fireman on the underground. He's now 99 and the last person alive who can recall what the underground was like in those days.
I mean, we used to do 10 hours then round a circle. I think about 8 bags of coal we used to burn going round the circle. It was hot inside and cooler outside. Get the drafts and all that now. Going to Wimbledon one night, a cow got in our way and we chucked us off the road into a field. That was going to Wimbledon, night time. And then it's another thing, we had to be careful not to make too much smoke down underneath. We had a blower, make it cooler, you see, going through the tunnel.
In the tunnels, the train crew had instructions to create as little smoke as possible.
Oh, yes. Yes. And we never had to make any smoke either. Else you got the blinking sack.
As long as the underground was steam-driven, its possibilities were limited. But in 1890, a new form of underground appeared, the electrified deep-level tube, and this was to transform the transport system in London.
The opening of the deep-level tube system in 1890, of course, is of tremendous importance because now we're running deep below the surface instead of running just below the surface, which is what the Metropolitan line did. Now, when the Metropolitan was constructed, of course, it meant you had to do it near the surface, and that meant clearing property. It's a very expensive business. It remains a scar on the landscape, if you like. But once you can burrow underneath the ground, then you can go almost anywhere. Now, with this, well, the carriage we're in now is, in fact, one of the earliest of the deep-level tube carriages, the City and South London, 1890. Then you get the Central Line, then the 3 tubes that follow, the Bakerloo, Piccadilly and Northern Line. And all of these make it possible for the first time to get across London and, of course, out to the suburbs. You can get into the West End. You couldn't do that before because you can go under the ground and you don't destroy property to do it.
By 1907, the basic structure of London's tubes had been constructed, and a new era in London's transport and the capital's development had begun. It was to lead to a new kind of suburbia, to be created in places like Golders Green. And in time, the electrification of the Metropolitan line was to take commuting London out into Metroland in the 1920s and 30s.